Hey, everybody, welcome to the Book Fest. Today, I have a wonderful group of authors with me, and we're going to be talking about building the worlds that you read in our books. I would like to welcome Tricia Copeland, the award-winning author of Kingdom of Embers, to Be Fae Queen, Lovelock Ones, plus 17 other titles, and Azreya, Aztec Priestess, and host of Finding the Magic Book podcast. Also with us is Sebastian de Castell, award-winning fantasy author of Traitor's Blade, Spellslinger, and 16 other novels with work translated into a dozen languages. That is really impressive, man. Hollis Jo McCollum, award-winning author of the Rasheen series and the Lost Beacon Chronicles, is with us today. She creates epic, dark, and historical fantasy and hosts a podcast on writing and storytelling. And finally, we have Amy Wolf, author of 12 novels, including The Miss Bronte's Establishment, and former Hollywood Studios executive with 20th Century Fox and Warner Brothers. I'm your host today, author Beth A. Freely. You probably know me because I'm a Belfast bellwether. A Bookfest bellwether. See, I'm already tripping over my own tongue. Yes. And my own novels include Beyond the Steps of Stone, a Bookfest winner, The Lock, and The Legend of Captain St. Pierre. So we are going to talk about world building. Now, we all know that the worlds that we create in our books, whether it's a romance novel or a fantasy novel or a sci-fi novel, set up the scene and the tone for what our readers enjoy the most. And of course, every author has a different process for world building. So let's get started and let's find out what our authors do to build their worlds. Tricia, you're the quiet one over there in my lower right-hand corner. Talk to me about how you get started building the worlds for your novels.
My books are really character-based, so usually I have an idea for a character before I have an idea for my world. And you know, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but that's what's happened in the past with both my fantasy series. So I create this character. I create maybe some of the challenges that she will have, maybe kind of think about who she is and what I want her to represent, or what I want her challenge or her struggle to represent. And then I start building in the layers of her world around that. What does she need to do? What powers is she going to have? What's going to limit her? What's going to challenge her? And, you know, what kind of setting is she in so that it can highlight all of her special qualities, or, you know, just themes that I want the readers to think about. So that's how I start my world building. I don't know like how other people do it, but that's how I've traditionally done it.
Amy, what about you? How do you start your world building?
Well, I'm a big nerd and I'm a former database developer. So I start off with this. Yeah, right on. Here we go.
Here we go.
Yeah, here we go. So I start off with a clean database, into which I type in all of my notes with pictures for reference. So the way that I think of a world is, and even in fantasy, it still has to make sense, right? You know, it's not like anything goes. Even the magic has to have a logic to it. So Hollis, you're a historian, and I approach it like that. It's like, in this world, what would the currency be? What would they eat? What kind of clothes from the materials that are available? You know, I ask myself all the questions, you know, as far as our world. You know, all of those details have to be thought out. And again, they need to be logical, right? Because if I've got a bunch of dragons and they're gourmets, well, where are they getting, you know, their prime rib au jus from? It's got to be some supply, right? So that's pretty much that's how I roll.
I love the thought of gourmet dragons. That is awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Sebastian, what about you? How do you build your worlds?
So somewhat similar to Tricia, I'm usually starting from, not necessarily from character, but what I think of as character in situation. And that situation for me will usually involve some kind of, for want of a better term, like cultural artifact. So I'll have a thought like, why is it we have, certain things in our society, like when we think of celebrity culture, for example, where we will sort of value celebrities in one way, but not in another. Why did we never have the idea that when an actor goes on stage, that sometimes they are actually channeling the spirit of the historical figure they're playing? I once fight directed, choreographed the sword fights for production of Richard III in London, and I remember that whole process that the actors go through sometimes of sort of embodying their characters. And I thought, you know, why don't we have the sort of mythology around this? And that will sort of make me go, okay, I need a culture in which the idea that sometimes when you go to the theater and see actors performing a historical stage play, that sometimes one of them is so good, they're called a varistor, and they actually channel the spirit of that character. And therefore, I need a culture that values theater in that way. I need a city that's kind of built around the other modes of culture around that. And that, you know, from that, I'll get sort of like Play of Shadows, which is what that sort of became. But so for me, I'm starting with this seed of, I need a world or a setting in which this idea that interests me is viable. And then that sort of that seed almost becomes a thematic anchor around which I'll go, well, you know, I want to see all these different pieces. So that's kind of how I tend to work.
Now, Hollis, you mentioned before, earlier before we got started, that you do a lot of historical background research and stuff with yours as well.
Yes.
How much of your world building do you do before you start writing, and how does it evolve as you go through?
So it's the world of Rashawn. It's the Rashawn series, by the way. But I
apologize for butchering any names. We're good.
That's okay. Yep. But the world of Rashawn, it's called that series because that's the name of the world. It was actually started as a D&D campaign that I played. I'm one of those, like, you know, role-playing nerds. Yes. And so it started out as character-based a little bit, but I'm kind of a jumble when it comes to the world building. So yes, the character, but I also like to draw the map. I hand draw all my own maps that are in my books and things like that. I'm an artist as well. I did a lot of freelance to pay for groceries in college. And you know, I do that, but I do think about it in the historical context, because my Rashawn series is pure fantasy. It's pure, you know, dark, epic, romantasy kind of stuff. And my other series, Lost Beacon Chronicles, is it's historical fantasy. So it technically takes place on Earth, just like another dimension of Earth. And so that is heavily based on the actual history of our world. But I take things like the ancient Etruscans of Italy, which were my personal specialization with my degree. I made, and my favorite thing ever, but they are actually a magical race of people called the Dockvens. They're not humans in my version of the Lost Beacon Chronicles. They're like this whole other race that I created and then built the world around that. So yeah, but I also find that just drawing the map is really fun. And Amy, you said you take a data-based approach to things. I kind of do the same thing you do. I kind of, because I think historically about it, and I'm like, oh, right. Well, what kind of climate do we have? You know, like that's a big deal, right? That's going to dictate how people live, period. So, you know, for example, Rashawn is completely temperate. There are no tropical zones in the world of Rashawn. It is kind of a cool, like, temperature-wise planet. And in my mind, it's smaller than Earth. It's not big, or it's not as large as our world is, and that sort of thing. So the amount of time it takes to sail across the ocean is, you know, maybe 2 months or 1 month instead of 4 or whatever it took back in the day to sail across the Atlantic, and all those other things. And then what crops would grow, what kind of people live where, what kind of cultures would they have? For example, in the Rashawn series, the sequel, the last book in the Rashawn trilogy that is coming in October, Terror in the World, they're on a remote little grouping of islands in the northern area that's kind of heavily based climate-wise on Scotland. And but they're cannibals who live on those islands. And so, but then how do those cannibals live? What do they do? And that kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of heavily based on that, but I like to draw the map and then look at these things and go, well, these little islands I created, they're pretty remote. Seems like a great place to put some cannibals where nobody ever wants to go ever, and you know, that kind of thing. And then you just sprinkle it out.
So in my case, I write romance novels and I write across subgenres. All right. So when I was actually working on Beyond the Steps of Stone, which is my sci-fi romance, it's a post-apocalyptic story that takes place 2,000 years in the future. So, of course, my brain was going, what is the Earth like 2,000 years in the future when Mother Earth has pretty much jumbled everything up? We don't know what's happened. Was there a nuclear war? Was there not a nuclear war? What kind of world would these people be stepping into 2,000 years into the future? So when I started writing Beyond the Steps of Stone, I actually had to stop and really think about how the world would change. And as a sci-fi nerd, you have to look into different things like, has the axis shifted? If you watch Stargate, some Stargate things are based on some science. So when you look at the sky, how has the star shifted? How has the Earth's tilting or shifting changed what you see in the sky? So in regards to the sci-fi, I have to stop and actually think about, what are we looking at in the future? For historical romance, like The Legend of Captain St. Pierre, I had to stop and go, okay, what was the world like during the height of piracy in the Caribbean? And while we can read histories and learn about what the world was like, what was it really like? Because we weren't there, we didn't experience it. So really, what was it like? Was it as hot and humid in the Caribbean as we know it to be now? Was it cooler? You also have the world building around the type of people that lived there, which that comes up to another question. Your societies. How do you develop your societies once you have gotten the basic idea for your world building? What elements do you find yourself putting into your societies as you're starting to build everything out? Who wants to go first? Somebody jump in. Sebastian, jump in. Let's hear what you got.
Excellent. So again, for me, my tendency, because my stories tend to sort of, all fantasy stories are, we could say, are character centered, right? We all write character based stories, but I think the distinction isn't about how faithful one writer is to character versus another writer's faithfulness to plot or something like that. It's more just about how where the sort of the gravity is causing other things to come into it. And so for me, because I'm usually thinking very much of that character, what is that character like? I then fundamentally construct the societies around them in terms of what's the worst society for them to be in. So with Traitor's Blade, for example, which was my first book, Falkio is has wanted to be one of the great coats, these legendary traveling magistrates, who would have to fight duels to uphold their verdicts. He had this heroic ideal ever since he was a kid. And so by the time the story begins, and I've set him in a world where people think the knights are wonderful, and the knights in that world, as honestly they were mostly in our world, are basically thugs. And people think that justice is overrated, and so they don't believe in any of the things he believes in. And so I try to construct a society that basically kind of functions, however poorly, but that represents everything that is in a way antithetical or problematic for my character. Because I want there to be the potential that any time that character interacts with another member of their society, that there's an automatic natural point of conflict. It was the same with Spellslinger, where Spellslinger is set in a world where magic is incredibly valued, or in this particular society that we begin in, the Gentep. And Kellen, the main character, his father is a famous sort of Lord Magus. His mother is even more famous as a mage. His younger sister is the most promising mage of her generation. And his own magic has completely failed him. And he's now having to sort of contend with, who am I in this world? And so for me, that's always the most interesting place. And so my societies will tend to go around that rather than say, and sometimes that will lead me to go, okay, well, I want the Gentep to almost be like, what if the ancient Egyptians had crossed the water and lasted into the 18th century American frontier? What would that look like? Like sometimes I will sort of go there, but I go there through that path of conflict with character, as opposed to sort of what I think is a perfectly reasonable way that a lot of people do, is go, I'm really interested in the society of, let's say, 16th century Venice. How do I now build that out as my own fantasy society and find conflicts within that?
I like the idea that you look for, the worst part of society first and kind of put your characters in there, because that actually takes a very interesting take on how you build your world. Now, Tricia, a little different question for you. You write, one of your books is called To Be Fae Queen, which is leading me to believe that you write about the Fae and the world of fairies. How do you build the societies for your worlds and your books dealing with that kind of magical and supernatural element of Fae kind?
Right. So I took a different take on Middle Earth when I knew I wanted. So the main character is Titania. The series is called the Realm Chronicles series, which begins with To Be a Fae Queen. In the beginning of the book, she's a Fae princess. She's 15 years old. And in their society, it's a very patriarchal society. There's monarchies there's 9 kingdoms, and each of them is led by a male monarch that gets passed. The leadership gets passed to the firstborn son. But Titania has lost her 4 older brothers, so she's the only one to take the crown. And she does a really good job in defeating these kobolds that's invading their kingdom. And her father decides he's old and wants to give her the crown. And she's worked really hard for this. And she believes that she can do it and she wants it, but she's the first female monarch in her whole realm in the history of time.
Right.
And I didn't really follow rules of other Fae. I didn't look them up before I read that, and I'm not sure if that was a good point or a bad point. But my Fae live in Middle Earth, which is under the human realm. So it's set in contemporary human time, but my Fae live under our bedrock, sort of. So so it's called Middle Earth because it's between Upper Earth, which is the human realm, and Lower Earth, which is Hell or Sheol.
Right.
So there are fairy rings. I had to create the fairy rings and how they opened and closed them so they could get to the human realm, and they could also get to Lower Earth. And spirits can pass between them, but there are also rules of if the Fae stay in the human realm for too long or other little things, they can't go back. And then there are rules about who can come into the Middle Earth, or they end up having to stay forever. So it was interesting, Sebastian. So I put them in the worst world for them, because maybe I did that a little bit for Titania, because she's blazing trails all over the place.
Now, Amy, you said that you use a database to track all of your world building. Have you ever run into a problem with when you actually sit down and you start writing and you're referring back to your database? Have you run into the info dump problem?
Not at all. I hate info dump. I am a Clarion West graduate, and right on. And we don't do info dumps. What I do is I introduce exposition during action, during dialogue or action, so it doesn't bore the heck out of people. So no, I don't tend to do that. I mean, I have, it's like Francis Coppola, he'll shoot 1 million feet of film, for only a few reels.
For a few seconds,
so I have way more information than I need, but, I've been doing this a while, so I hone it down. And the other thing, Hollis, speaking to historical fantasy, I also write historical fiction. And I do a big database for that. And thank you. It's 2 books, and it's called A Woman of the Road, and it posits a female highway woman in 16th century England. She said, plug. Thank you.
Serious plug, yes.
Oh yeah. So basically, I have 2 historical fantasy series, both of which involve dragons. The first one is set on basically Turkey in 500 AD. And it's called The Dragon of Light and Chaos. And that's pretty much what it is. Every 100 years, they have this monumental battle. It could last as long as 9 years. And it's basically trying to restore balance to the earth. So, so I found, I really researched my brains out, found a lot of fascinating facts. And I also love caves, so I incorporated that. And there you go. Now, my other historical fantasy is it's about the 12 labors of Nick. Okay. He has to re-perform the 12 labors of Hercules. So this is kind of a comic grease, like my Sphinx tends to sound like, Rodney Dangerfield. Okay. So I'm taking a comic twist, but I still wanted to research, the Greek gods and the Olympians and the monsters and so on, so that even though they're mythical, I wanted it to be real. Right. So my other dragon, whatever you call 4 books, help me out, people. 4 books. It's called a
quartet. Let's call it a quartet.
Let's call it a quad.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a rectangle. That world I made up completely from scratch. But I had to give them a history. Like, what the heck are these dragons doing on this other planet, Cavernus? How did they get there? So I did construct the whole backstory of their history, and I did what I wanted. Like, I have some dragons who are CPAs and lawyers. Okay. So yeah.
Okay. I'm digging this. Yeah.
Cool.
Powerful and intelligent.
Right? Some of my kind of dragons.
Absolutely. They got their own school, their own rowing team. I'm telling you. And they are gourmets. So I think
they just sound like marriage material. I mean,
you know what? If they weren't 7 feet tall, they would be. But the thing is that for historical fiction, I think you have more of a comfort zone, right, Hollis? Yeah. In other words, here are these facts, and on top of that, I can layer my own thing. Whereas when you're just creating your world out of whole cloth, you got to put a lot of thought into that. So, absolutely. But I still do databases.
Absolutely.
Databases for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, just
go for it. Please.
Even with historical fantasy, like you have it's great when you're doing something based in history, because even though you're playing with it and you're like magic and all of that, you still have this lovely little linear thing that actually happened that you're kind of remolding into your thing. Like Spare the Swallow, plug is the origin story of the main character Lucretia for the Lost Beacon Chronicles. And that, and she, like I said, the Etruscans, I make them into a fantasy race called the Docfens. But what happens is we're talking about the fall of the Etruscan Empire, which, like the Romans kind of mowed them over after the Etruscans built Rome and gave them all the technology by the way. Just saying,
Romans were good at that in the first place.
Romans were a bunch of sheep herders before the Etruscans came along and built Rome. Just like the historian in me has to say, I get a little feisty. But they come along and I have that to talk about, and I have the trauma to talk about. I have the culture to reference. I can talk about divination in the Etruscans because they were actually crazy spiritual and they were really amazing. They had all sorts of prophecies. They actually predicted their own demise quite accurately. Like thousands of over 1,000 years before they fell, they predicted almost to the year that their empire would fall. Their divination, and just FYI, fun little historical fact, the Pope and the bishops and the funny hats and robes they all wear?
Yep.
That's what the Etruscan priests wore.
Ooh,
Catholic,
that is a nice
official outfits are still based on the ancient Etruscan priest outfits. Those are their outfits.
Ooh, wow.
Speaking of weird priestly outfits, and how we build our worlds and how we're looking at societies and everything like that, and to keep from info dumping. Tricia, you've done a book called Azreya, Aztec Priestess. How much Aztec research did you do for that book and for that world building?
Oh, there's a UK site about the Mayan, Aztec, and Inca civilizations and people. I lived on that site like day and night for 60 days, probably. There was so much information on that site about what they ate, what they drank, what their society liked, how they sent their children to school, the rules of their society, how they built their houses, and it's illustrated too. So my artist was very much immersing himself in their culture and what everything would have looked like in that time. And so, we did tons of research. And even in the book, I have their glossary of terms because I use their language, and I use some of their original Aztec terms in to call some of the, not a lot, so it didn't throw you off a lot, but at least it was bringing that into the book so that you could get just a sense of being in where they were.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. All right.
Yeah.
So now let's switch gears a little bit here. We've had our historical fiction. We've, at least 4 of us have pulled a lot of research to write historical fictions of some sort. Now, Sebastian, you've pulled research probably to write your vampire story.
No, that's the,
okay.
interestingly enough.
Okay.
I'm the worst on this front. No, I was before we started, I was telling the story of the sequel to Malevolent 7, which, by the way, was very intentionally a book that I wrote during a worldwide event of non-particular significance in 2020. That shall go nameless, where I was going, you know what, I'm going to write something, and I'm just going to write whatever I feel like that goes. I'm not going to invoke any sort of historicism, which I sometimes do, of course. The Great Coats, the idea of traveling magistrates in Trader's Blade was derived from the 12th century justices itinerant of England, which later on became the notion of circuit courts in the United States. They're still called circuits, circuit courts. It was because actually a judge and 2 lawyers rode on a circuit town to town and heard cases and so all that. But with Malevolent 7, I intentionally wanted to sort of go away from that. But when I was pitching for the sequel, I needed another interesting, monstrous sort of character. So I just went vampire kangaroo sounds good. But then slowly I've been trying to describe this, finding how far I can get away with describing this fairly sort of dystopian fantasy world, just this bleak, wrecked place with all horrible people, how closely I can get to making it sound like Australia without anybody figuring it out and getting really mad at me. I love Australians. I used to, when I went backpacking in my 20s, you'd always meet tons of Australians. They're always the nicest people in the world, but I always just loved the idea of sort of secretly mocking Australia as like the most dangerous, horrible place on the planet.
Well, apparently they set that up for us, when they released the first Mad Max movie. So I think you're okay with that.
Yeah. But what I would say on the history front. So interestingly enough, my master's work was all in history, and I think for people who want to write, who are building their worlds, one of the interesting ways history can inform that is actually in terms of sort of historiography, or in terms of the way in which history breaks down into lenses. So when we tend to think of history, when we tend to I'm going to go to the bookstore and buy a history of, let's say, Venice, you think, well, it's just going to be the history of Venice. But of course, after you get out of your undergrad, there's no such thing. Like, no one talks about history. What we talk about is social history, or military history, or economic history, or labor history, or feminist history, or art history. Or the area that I was most interested in was cultural history, which kind of informs my work. And each of those, there's an art history of World War II. You would think World War II, you just think World War II. Like, it was just, there was war. It must all be military. But of course, there was labor history, social history, feminist history. And each of those lenses we'll still touch on all of those. We'll still get to all those pieces, but they'll see it through a different lens. And what's interesting about people as they move up as they study history is finding the particular historical lens that feels most attuned to them. And I think when writers are starting and they're trying to build worlds, they often feel like, I have to just have this weird completeness. Like, I have to create the encyclopedia. And for some people who have the mind for that, that's wonderful. Like, when you can do it. And I find a lot of people who are like dungeon masters are quite good at that. I'm terrible at it. When I played D&D in the last couple of years, it was always as a warlock, because then you don't have to make any decisions. It's just Eldritch Blast all day long. But for people who are struggling, like, I want to build a world, it's sometimes useful to go, what's the lens that I kind of like to look at the world through? And so for me, that happens to be cultural history, which is why at the beginning I said, I like the idea of this culture where people think that certain actors go on stage. The theater culture is so rich that they think that, they can channel the spirits of the characters that they're playing. And that's a very sort of, but there's a labor perspective on that. There's a military perspective on that.
Right.
There's all of these things. I sometimes think in terms of, for example, I'm just going to pop out a visual aid randomly here. But something like, this is a silver coin. It's a fairly recent silver coin based on a Dutch one. But when you look at this coin, you can ask why, what's on here. You look at it through economics and think of the silver and the value and what it's for.
Right.
But you can look at, this is what's called a silver round, and it's from the US. And there's no particular reason. Its only value is in the silver that's in this physical coin. But they want to have an eagle on it, and why do they want to have an eagle on it? What is it? And so you can look at a single thing like currency, even a single artifact, which for me is always an easier entry point, like one tiny piece, and ask, why are they putting an eagle on it, or a horse, or the St. George and the Dragon on a coin? Why do they that? How much is that coin worth? How hard is it to get? How hard is it to make? And you can take a single artifact and actually delve quite deep into that overall world that you're creating. So for some writers, I say, if you're struggling with sort of the massive nature of constructing a world, sometimes find one artifact that just feels really interesting to you, and then kind of spider out from there.
Okay, so taking this idea of finding one artifact, Tricia, Hollis, and Amy, have you found a particular lens or artifact or something that has helped you blow out your worlds, in a way? It was that aha moment, kind of like what Sebastian was talking about. Did you have that aha moment when you found that lens, so to speak?
No. Let me answer that succinctly. I've never really been inspired by an artifact, although I do certainly collect a ton of pictures in my database, different dragons of different colors and types and eyes and their claws. But I don't have a physical artifact that has.
But no, the pictures, I think would count, because you're collecting something that's helping you write. Tricia, what about you?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and this is going to be embarrassing because I can't remember the name of the person, but my witches in the Kingdom Journals, which starts with Kingdom of the Embers, it's a trinity of witches who have to come together to find this blade, and it's the blade that pierced Jesus's body, and I can't remember the person who did it. Anyway,
I know.
It's like my mind is blanking because it's
Longinus.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's Longinus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So they have to find this blade, and I guess that's one of the artifacts that I started around. Like, how would they find it? Where would it be? Doing research about, all these historical religious relics, and where were they kept, and where they might be kept. And so it's an urban fantasy, so it's a contemporary urban fantasy. But that was one of the things that kind of started me looking at, what the curse would be that they're trying to break, and why do they need to find this article, and the significance of it, and what it meant to various people, and what it meant to the witches and the vampires in my story.
I would like to say, so I'm gonna quote one of my old history professors, because it really plays into the lenses. So shout out to Dr. Jarrett Vogt, thank you. But in a lecture, he was talking about a particular event in history, but he said, now keep in mind, everyone has a different point of view, but there's something that we're all looking at. And that to me was succinctly kind of put it together. So I do, when I am writing characters, especially if you have, a ragtag group of heroes that are coming together from different cultures and things like that, they are all going, they all might look at, for example, in the first book in the Rashawn series, To Save the World, there is this artifact called the Stone of Elysius, where there was a great wizard named Elysius who imbued all of his magical powers into this big chunk of quartz and then hid it away, and it was fabled, and of course they found it, but you could then use it to do kind of whatever you wanted, was the thought, because he was such a great and powerful wizard. But they all had a different perspective on the best way to use it, or or what they should do with it, or where it might be, and all of these things. And it was all, you know, based on their own personal experiences and what they needed in a certain way. And I think that is a really great way to world build, is if you do have a unifying, you know, you can have a unifying artifact like the I'm going to mispronounce it, the Lance of can you say that again for me, Amy?
Sure. It's the Lance of Longinus.
Longinus. I always want to say Longinus. I did, yeah, and I need to see things written sometimes. But the Lance of Longinus, you know, and that's another one of those great examples. Sure. Like everyone, all of your witches probably have a different perspective on how it should be operated or where they should even look. And that's a really fun thing to do. Yeah.
So for me, when I was writing Beyond the Steps of Stone, again, I go back to looking at what the world was like, and especially how, because my hero is an alien, he's an alien race coming from another galaxy. I was looking at the stars. And for me, Orion was my lens. Orion was that item that, you know, really just kind of pulled it together, because Orion is what winds up connecting both the Elorvians' world and our world, because Lord Jericho Jariath has it tattooed on his chest. And I took aspects of different things, and what do the stars on Orion align to on Earth. So I find it interesting that we all have those different things that we looked at, that we collect in our minds to build our worlds. So we have a few minutes left. Let's go ahead and let's do a little wrap up. If you had to tell an up and coming author or someone who's trying to break into writing their first book, what is the advice each of you would give them on how to start building their worlds? Hollis, let's start with you.
Well, I would say, first of all, don't overwhelm yourself. One of the things that I like to do is I always break it down. You don't have to do it all at once. And I'm a big role player. I'm a big fan of getting out a character sheet from whatever system you want. You can go download these, and they have world building sheets, and it just organizes. You can do the same thing for characters, for character development. It just can help organize your thoughts. Then you write it down, and it also covers different things that you might not be thinking about. But I would say, don't overwhelm yourself. Take it a piece at a time, and find an organizational system that works for you, that's not going to make you go nuts. Because your ideas are all great. Just, it's okay.
Sebastian, what's your advice?
Don't start anything in a tavern. No, I say this mostly facetiously, because you can write wonderful tavern scenes, and there's a reason why they come up so much, because they were important places at a certain period of time. So Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, has kind of an interesting way of plotting a novel, which I've never done. But he says he'll literally start with a really interesting city like Madrid, and he'll find all the most interesting places on it, and he'll go, oh, there's this old military fortress. Oh, there's the Gaudi Cathedral, and he'll say, I don't know what I'm going to do or how they're going to get there, but I know I want a big battle scene here, and I know I want someone to die here, or a big intrigue moment here. And so that's kind of an interesting way to look at it, because the one thing that does is it guarantees that wherever your action's taking place, there will be an intersection between the action that's happening and the place, and the place will be interesting enough to play a role in that action, as opposed to one of the mistakes that I sometimes make, often in early drafts, is I'll be writing all these scenes that are, in a sense, taking place in what we call a white room. There's no, you're just not sure where it is, because it's, and people will then think, well, no, if I just, I'll make sure to describe it. Like, oh, I made sure I put the wall color and how big it was. But then it's still not interacting with the action. Right. So when you're thinking of something like, I'm going to write in a tavern, or I need a scene, I need the characters to be having a conversation about some mission, and you go, I guess I'll set it in a tavern. The first question is, does it have to be in a tavern? Is there something I can do that has the things I need from a tavern, but is my own kind of place, my own kind of setting that I haven't seen lots of times before. And the second thing to do is go, how can I make this setting or interact with the action that the characters are undergoing? Because otherwise there's that risk that you might write tons and tons and tons of detail about the world that you then present, and you can present it very well, but if it doesn't actually interact with the characters, then it's not actually interacting in the story.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
So those two things I think are helpful to me.
Yeah.
Tricia?
I feel like I'm going to mirror everything everybody said. And I'm going to kind of take on what Sebastian said before about what is your lens? Like, what are you drawn to? What's important to you? What do you want your characters to say? I mean, you might want your book to be completely about entertainment and fantastical fun, right? I mean, just to take the reader out of this world we're in into another world. That may be the goal, and that's a great goal because there's a lot of room to play with that too. But it might be have a theme, a faith, a perseverance, whatever that is. So, and I really like the idea of not being tied to one way to do it. Like if somebody told me to write my stuff in a data file or a spreadsheet, I'd be like, no. Yep. And I have no artistic talent, but I write things down in books and journals and I keep them forever. Hopefully they will last forever because I have them nowhere else. But now my editor is making me write outlines. So that's
the evil outline.
It's happening after the fact, so that's okay. It's still getting done. So yeah, I think everybody's going to have their different process and their different worldview style. And like Hala said, just start with one idea, one thought, one theme, and grow from there.
Mm-hmm.
And Amy.
All right. Even though I am a database nerd, I start off world building by freestyling. In other words, my little fingers go over that keyboard in Word, and I just go through the whole imaginative thought process. Where are they? Why? What's the history? What do they eat? What do they wear? How did this happen? And then I will go the database route. One thing I could say too is go to Clarion, okay? Because you need to learn how to write before you build that world. And I recommend that program, 6 weeks of a writer's boot camp that you will never forget. Another thing, Sebastian, in accord with what you said, I can't separate out the elements of a novel. Today I'm going to write the character, tomorrow's the plot, and day 3 I'm going to insert the setting. Because for me, they say that plot is character. We've all heard that. To me, setting is character. I try to throw in things that are relevant. They might be metaphors. They might be so subtle that you don't know. But it does have something to do with the character and the action. That way you avoid the info dumps. So for me, it's a very freewheeling process. I teach college essay applications, and one of my techniques is just go. Just write a bunch of stuff. Just go. And then at the end, you can combine it and you can hone it. So that's what I do.
So my advice, plays off of what everybody else has said. But also the biggest advice that I have for anybody out there that wants to start writing is just do it. Sit down with pen and paper, sit down with your computer, write the story. Because you know what? The world building sometimes can come later. Same with the full character development. Get the story on paper so you have a framework. Mm-hmm. All right. We are almost at time, and this has been a fantastic conversation. Before we go, real quick, let's start with Amy. Tell people where they can find you and where they can find your books.
You can find me on the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. But basically, I'm wide. I'm everywhere. I am on Amazon. I am on BNN. I'm on Apple. I'm on Kobo. So you can check me out on Amazon first. I've got a whole author profile, and you'll see all 15 of my books.
Tricia, where can people find you, and give us just a little quick update on your podcast?
Sure. My website is triciacopeland.com, so pretty easy to get there to that. And I have 2 free short stories if you sign up for my newsletter, so that's a great intro to my books. My podcast is Finding the Magic Podcast. I talk to authors about their stories, their worlds, their characters, all different kind of authors. So if you're a reader and interested, you can just go to my YouTube channel. It's also Tricia Copeland Author, or Author Tricia Copeland. All my stuff is like that. So that's the best way to find me.
Sebastian, where can people find you?
I'm pretty easy to find. My website is decastell.com, so DECASTELL. My books are pretty much everywhere. If you're looking for a book that has world building, so Crucible of Chaos is a recent book of mine, and the setting for that was very much inspired by Mont Saint Michel, which is a 13th century monastery off the coast of France that's only accessible from a causeway.
Mm-hmm.
It's perfect for a supernatural, swashbuckling Agatha Christie-esque kind of story. But that's an example of taking a very specific place and then letting yourself be the basis of that. Play of Shadows is a pretty elaborately developed setting and world based on the things I talked about. And if you want to see what doing virtually no world building looks like, then Malevolent 7 is probably the counterexample to all the good advice you've heard today.
And finally, Liz, tell us where they can find you and a little bit about your podcast.
So I'm on Amazon. I'm on Barnes and Noble. I'm on, I'm the everywheres as well. I live in North Metro Atlanta, though I'm not from here. I'm a Navy brat. My books, I actually design my own covers and page layouts.
Ooh,
this is the Rashawn series, To Save a World, The Queen Witch, and book 3 in the trilogy is coming out in October. I need to get my shit together. Somebody is still finishing edits and getting the page layout done. But I'm due. It's coming. It's coming. Maybe later in October. But I'm going to get it together.
All right.
You didn't sound panicked at all, by the way.
No, not panicked at all.
The cover is designed. I know what it's supposed to look like, so we're fine. But yeah, that's it. So yeah, and I'm at HollisterMcCullumAuthor.com, and you can pivot to my podcasts, you can pivot to my whatevers. And I always say email me. I'd love to communicate, DM me, whatever. I'll talk to you.
All right. And of course, I'm your moderator, Beth A. Freely. You can find me across the board. I'm wide like everybody else, or you can find me on my website at bethanne freely.com. My most recent book is called Sculpting Love, so check that one out if you get a moment. I want to say thank you to our wonderful authors today about talking about world building. And of course, please, if you have any questions about world building, or if you are stuck writing your own novel, feel free to reach out to any of us. We are always willing to sit and talk to other authors and help you out and get you going. Make sure you check out everything that the Book Fest has to offer this year. And until next time, I'm Beth A. Freely saying goodbye and have a great day and keep writing.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.